Ludwig von Mises is the greatest economist of all times and one of the towering figures of Western civilization. He was a fountainhead of the revival of classical liberalism and libertarianism after World War II. In what follows, I will give a concise introduction to his life and works. Mises was born Ludwig Heinrich Edler von Mises in Lemberg, Austria, which is today Lviv in Ukraine. The son of Arthur von Mises, a railroad engineer and civil servant, and Adele von Mises, born Adele Landau. Mises was still a small boy when his family moved to Vienna. Already as a boy, he was interested in history and politics. Therefore, after graduation from high school in 1900, he began to study at the University of Vienna at the Department of Law and Government Science. Mises started off as an exponent of the so-called historical school of economics, which stressed fact-finding and despised theoretical analysis. But in the fall of 1903, he read Karl Menger's Principles of Economics, the foundational text of the so-called Austrian School of Economics. The book turned Mises away from the historicist approach, and in the following years he deepened his studies of economic theory, especially in the seminar of Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, a former finance minister and champion of the Austrian school. Mises graduated in February 1906 with a doctorate in law. He started a career as a civil servant in Austria's financial administration, but after a few months he quit in disgust with bureaucracy. Then he worked as a trainee in a Vienna law firm and also started lecturing on economics. In early 1909, he joined the Vienna Chamber of Commerce and Industry, where he worked for the next 25 years. The chamber was at the time a semi-governmental organization and through its publications exercised a considerable influence on Austrian politics. Parallel to his professional career, Mises pursued ambitious scholarly interests and wrote a treatise on money and banking. It was published in 1912 under the title Theorie des Geldes und der Umlaufsmittel, which was translated into English in 1934 under the title Theory of Money and Credit. During World War I, Mises served as a front officer in the Austro-Hungarian artillery and as an economic advisor to the War Department. He gained first-hand experience of the realities of war socialism, which he would later digest into his theory of socialism and of the dynamics of government interventionism. After the war, Mises briefly became an adjunct member of the new Republican government of German Austria. He was the authority on financial matters pertaining to foreign affairs, but his main practical achievement in this period was to persuade socialist leader Otto Bauer, a former friend and fellow student, not to attempt a Bolshevik coup. He also published a book explaining the collapse of multicultural Austria-Hungary. In Nation, State and Economy, a book that was published in 1919 in German and translated in 1983 into English, he argued that German imperialism had resulted from applying the power of the state to solve the problems of the multicultural communities that characterized the eastern provinces of Germany and Austria. In the fall of 1919, Mises wrote his most famous essay on economic calculation in the socialist commonwealth. He argued that a socialist leadership lacked the essential tool for the rational allocation of resources, namely economic calculation, and that only the money prices of a capitalist economy make it possible to compare the different investment projects in terms of a common denominator. 2 years later, he published a treatise on socialism. The German title was Die Gemeinwirtschaft, published in 1922 and translated into English in 1936, which had a decisive impact on a whole generation of rising intellectual leaders, men such as Friedrich August von Hayek and Wilhelm Röpke, who after World War II would lead the nascent neoliberal movement. In the late 1920s, Mises started publishing papers on the epistemological character of economics. He argued that economic science could not be verified or refuted through the analysis of observable data. Economics was an a priori science like mathematics or logic or geometry. Moreover, economics was just part of a larger social science which he would later call Praxelogy, the logic of human action. Eventually, Mises found the time to synthesize the different strands of his work into a praxeological treatise when, in 1934, he was called to a chair in international economic relations at the Graduates Institute for International Studies in Geneva. He would hold the chair until 1940, the same year in which his treatise was finally published under the title Nationalökonomie. While in Geneva in 1938, Mises married Margit Sereni, who was born at Herzfeld, whose daughter Gitta Sereni later became a well-known author. They had no children of this marriage. In July 1940, Mises left Geneva to avoid being captured by the German armies or being delivered to them by the Swiss government. He moved to New York City and started a new life, receiving US citizenship in 1946. He first found employment with the National Bureau of Economic Research, then worked as an advisor to the National Association of Manufacturers, and eventually became a visiting professor at New York University. He would visit New York University from 1945 to 1969. In the US, he became the spiritus rector of the nation libertarian movement, to which he gave a distinct Austrian flavor. His influence reached a peak in the years following the publication of the English version of his praxeological treatise under the title Human Action in 1949. In the 1950s, his New York University seminar produced many important intellectual leaders of post-war libertarianism, such as Murray Rothbard, Hans Sennholz, George Reisman, Ralph Raico, Leonard Liggio, and Israel Kirzner. I pointed out already that Mises was a fountainhead of the revival of classical liberalism and libertarianism after World War II. His influence was based entirely on his groundbreaking contributions to social analysis and to monetary economics in particular. Mises revolutionized the theory of money. He was the first economist to develop a full-fledged explanation of money prices, and he was also the first to develop a comprehensive analysis of the causes and consequences of money production. His work renewed and greatly reinforced the case against monetary interventionism, which had been at the heart of classical economics. Let me say a few things about classical economics. Before Adam Smith, public opinion was infused with the opinion that the volume of spending, in today's Keynesian jargon known as aggregate demand, drives the economy. Politicians and businessmen therefore strove to increase the national money supply in order to promote production and growth. Smith argued that all of this was wrong. The true causes of aggregate wealth were to be seen in the division of labor and in a frugal lifestyle. Policies designed to increase the national money supply by encouraging exports and hampering imports were ineffective. They impoverished the nation rather than to promote its growth. This thesis inspired the intellectual movement known as classical economics. It has also inspired the economists of the Austrian school. When Karl Menger developed his price theory based on the rock-solid foundation of subjective value, he did not seek to overthrow classical economics root and branch. What he did was to repair one fundamental shortcoming of classical price theory, and in so doing, he solidified the overall edifice. Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk reinforced the classical teachings on savings and capital by analyzing the role of time in the production process. At the beginning of the 20th century, then, Ludwig von Mises completed the Austrian revision and reconstruction of classical economics with his theory of money. Adam Smith had neglected money because neither the demand for money nor the supply thereof were to be counted among the causes of the wealth of nations. Many of his disciples, especially the great David Ricardo, delved into the matter in more detail, but their writings suffered from the Achilles heel of Smith's theory, his cost of production theory of prices. They could therefore not quite come to grips with the economics of banking, and the consequence was a never-ending sequence of booms and busts. This practical failure in the field of money and banking eventually discredited the entire edifice of classical economics. Inflationist doctrines made a comeback, first creeping in the second half of the 19th century, then galloping around World War I, and eventually triumphing in the 1930s. Mises did not develop his theory of money in order to come up with a classical liberal case for non-interventionism. Quite to the contrary, it took him a while to understand the practical implications of what he had found. The first edition of his book actually was quite tame in that respect. It is only in the second edition of 1924 that Mises started to hammer the anti-interventionist implications of his work in monetary economics. At about the same time, he had begun to delve into other areas of research, most notably into the analysis of socialism and interventionism. These works, as I've already stated, brought him great fame, and they were instrumental in converting an entire generation of young intellectuals to classical liberal ideas. But his monetary thought would always remain the backbone of his thinking. Eventually, he would present it fully developed within a general theory of human action in Nationalökonomie and Human Action. It was Mises' personal misfortune that during all of his life, his economic and political ideas were thoroughly out of fashion. More than any other economist before or after him, he has clarified the political, social, and cultural implications of economics. Economic science was not merely the foundation of a comprehensive political program centered on private property rights. It was the scientific cornerstone of an entire worldview in which peace, cooperation, and tolerance reign supreme. His magnum opus, Human Action, is a handbook of the science of human liberty, a treatise of the scientific foundations and underpinnings of political liberalism. Its central idea is that economic rationality is logically and historically contingent. Contradicting on this point all economic literature since Adam Smith, as well as fellow Austrians including Wieser and Hayek, Mises stressed that calculation in terms of money prices is not just one form of economic calculus, it is the only type of economic calculus there is. It follows that human civilization is the fragile fruit of certain cultural conditions that are necessary for the emergence of monetary exchange. Here economics comes again into play. Learning, developing, and spreading the teaching of economic science has brought about an unheard of increase of living standards after the 18th century. Along with the cultural achievements of a great number of people who then became affluent enough to dedicate their lives to the arts and the sciences, to preserve these cultural standards, it is necessary not to lose sight of the economic foundations. It is necessary to learn economics. Mises stresses, and I quote him here, "This is, in our age, the primary civic duty." And he insists that the matter is too important to be entrusted to public education and government experts. Economics must not be relegated to the classrooms and statistical offices and must not be left to esoteric circles. It is the philosophy of human life and action and concerns everybody and everything. It is the pith of civilization and of man's human existence. These are Mises' words. In the concluding chapters of his magnum opus, he emphasized the importance of private education. It was an important lesson he had learned firsthand in his long life. Government sponsorship introduces a pro-government bias into economic education and economic research, thus undermining the social function of economic science. He concluded Human Action with this statement: "The body of economic knowledge is an essential element in the structure of human civilization. It is the foundation upon which modern industrialism and all the moral, intellectual, technological, and therapeutic achievements of the last centuries have been built. It rests with men whether they will make the proper use of the rich treasure with which this knowledge provides them, or whether they will leave it unused. But if they fail to take the best advantage of it and disregard its teachings and warnings, they will not annul economics. They will stamp out society and the human race." When Mises died in October 1973, he had only a small circle of admirers and disciples. But this group became the nucleus of a movement that has grown exponentially. Today, his writings inspire economists and libertarians throughout the world and are avidly read by an increasing number of students in all the social sciences.
For more content like this, visit Mises.org.